So hi everyone, today I'll be talking about two key things that you should consider when choosing your operating model. It's actually a common mistake that organisations make when choosing an operating model. They either choose an ops run it or a you build it, you run it model across the whole of their business. Now what I'm saying is that you want to choose an operating model that's specific to the services that you are delivering. So what I want to talk about is how you go about assessing and selecting your operating model for that given service. So I've already spoken about why taking a blanket approach to choosing your operating model can be problematic. So if you're interested to know more about that, check out the link in the description of this video or head to my channel and subscribe for more information. So let's get into the things you should consider when selecting an operating model for your specific service. There are two things that we really need to consider. The first thing is the demand of throughput for the service. So a service needs to evolve, and they need to evolve in order to meet your changing customer needs. But the rate that they need to evolve is different based on the organisation, the needs of the customers and users, and actually the responsibilities of the service itself. So demand of throughput looks at the rate of change that is actually needed for that service. The second thing we need to look at is the financial exposure on the failure of the service. So services need to be constantly reliable to protect your revenue, but also the costs associated with running those services, and importantly also your brand reputation. So think of your financial exposure as a mix of the revenue cover for the loss of revenue when your service is unavailable, but also the cost avoidance for that service when you have costs from an incident. Again, this exposure is different on a service by service basis. So just to clarify some terminology, when we talk about assessing a service, we're talking about anything from a digital service or a foundational system. These foundational systems can often be referred to as a core system. So for example, let's look at a retailer. You may have a digital service specifically responsible for the product descriptions of clothing that they sell. But compare that to the foundational system that could be an order management system that handles the orders and the deliveries. While they might often be quite different, you can see you can use the same metrics to assess the most appropriate operating model to both, even though you may end up with different results. So the first thing we're interested in is the demand of throughput that is required for any given service. So that means how often are changes actually needed for that service, and how often will it be valuable to deploy new features within a certain period of time. To answer those questions, you really need to ask yourself as a business, will this service benefit from getting deployments out to market quickly? And will this service benefit from launching new features to customers far more regularly? In my experience, there's a couple of ways that requirements for throughput can actually play out. So you might only want to change your service once a month, but when you make that change, you may need to deploy a few changes in it. So if we take the example of an order management system, changes here not only impact the users, but may require changes to their process or other systems. So these dependencies need to be organised and managed so the change itself is actually implemented successfully. To take into account things like training, process changes, or even getting new equipment. So for this reason, your needs are to have a much lower deployment throughput. So compare this to a requirement where you might have multiple changes per week for the service. And if we take the product description pages for clothing as an example, we may want to release new clothing items, or we may want to easily change and experiment on how that information is presented. Or we might want to add completely new features to that page, such as customer reviews or add a similar items section. All of these changes can happen independently and quickly, and they need to be able to be put in and taken out based on ease. And we want to be able to run those experiments. So for this reason, your deployment throughput needs to be really high. So when trying to determine if you are low or high on the selector model, we look at the frequency of single deployments, or we look at the number of deployments needed over a fixed time. If you're only deploying 1 or 2 features per fortnight, then that's a low requirement for throughput in the scheme of things. But if you're looking for multiple features deployed per week or even per day, that's a higher requirement for deployment throughput. The higher your requirements for deployment throughput, the more you'll benefit from having your deployment process automated, and the more likely your service will benefit using a you build it, you run it operating model. You'll also benefit from having granular control over how quickly the team can make deployments without having to rely on any rigid schedules or any gated milestones. So there's also an element of risk mitigation here, which is a benefit to consider for services that have a high throughput requirement. Automating your deployments help you to mitigate incidents that are associated with the deployment itself of those new features. So more frequent deployments means you can be more incremental in your approach. This will result in fewer features being deployed as a bundle, and there's less risk of failure. And it's also easier, faster and more cost effective to identify the cause of a failure in the event something happens during the deployment. So all of this is key to run in a you build it, you run it operating model to ensure that we're removing the burden of the teams on doing the deployment themselves. So most organisations want to be able to deploy things independently or control how much they deploy, but there are often the gates in the way into doing that because they're on a monthly, quarterly or even a fortnightly cycle, which means they have to take a batched up approach to the way they deliver, so they've got no choice. This squeezing into a batched approach also results in the deployment of a change being really tightly coupled to the launch of a change. And because the launch can be planned ahead of time and with many dependencies, this puts further and added pressure onto a delivery team. But the other side of the equation is, do I need things monthly, weekly or daily? And that depends really on how much change the service itself can take or how much change it wants to be able to take. So for example, a digital service, you might want to launch something out to a customer and do an experiment and learn how it's used and then tweak it and change it. And you can't do that so easily if you deploy on a weekly or fortnightly cycle. But you may not want to do that for your core business systems. So to recap, the first consideration to help you assess the operated model for your specific service is the requirement for deployment throughput. The next consideration is your financial exposure on failure for any specific service. So most organisations, when I speak to them, will ask them, how much does your service need to be up and available? And often the response is all the time, it needs to be up 24/7. But actually, does it really? Does your service really need to be up and available for all of that time? And this is where we start to try and ask some other questions to get into the real needs for availability on a service. Firstly, are you more financially exposed with it being down at one time a day compared to another, for example, day or night? Or also, how much will the business lose if a specific service goes down? And how much revenue is not generated if that service is not available? Also thinking about how many customer complaints will that cause, which in turn is going to cost you money. So when assessing the financial exposure on failure, we're actually looking at this from two angles. Firstly, the revenue that is lost when a service is unavailable, and secondly, the costs that occurred to you when that service is down. Okay, so let's look at two examples, both within a retailer. So a retailer has a payment service that's got greater financial exposure during the day as opposed to night. During the day, where people can't pay for their order, the lost revenue will be much greater than in the middle of the night when most people are in bed. The organisation may also have higher costs because those same people may call the call centre to ask if a payment's been taken or an order's been processed. And this will have a higher brand impact on that organisation as well. If this same thing happened at night, less people are less likely to be affected, resulting in less loss of revenue and less impact on costs and on your brand reputation. If you compare that to the order management system, for example, that would have financial exposure is greater during the day because there are workers who depend on it in order to process the orders. But at night, when the shift workers have gone home and no one is in the warehouse picking and packing orders, that's much lower. So although they don't lose revenue, it would have a high cost during the day, where at night the cost for these incidents would be much lower. So when I'm looking at an availability target, I'm looking at what my required availability is across the whole day or even a whole week. So 99.99% availability, that means that my service can only be down for 8.5 seconds a day, or 8.64 to be exact. Whereas 95% means I can be down for just over 1 hour. So something like an OMS system, their financial exposure on failure will be much lower than what most companies expect, because the service only needs to be available during certain hours. So this means a 95% or even a 90% may be more than adequate. Compare that to a digital service, the financial exposure on failure is typically much higher. So for this example, a higher availability target is much more appropriate. So something like the order management system that we talked about earlier, their financial exposure on failure will be much lower than what most companies expect, because the service only needs to be available during certain hours, for example, during the day and not while the shift workers are away at night. This means a 95% or even a 90% may be more than adequate. Now, if we compare that to the digital services, like the payment service, for example, the financial exposure on failure is typically much higher for this example, and a higher availability target is much more appropriate. Specifically looking at the financial exposure for these two retail services, we can see the financial exposure for digital services such as payments is going to be very high, but the financial exposure related to that of an order management system is going to be much lower. As such, you may not need to have the same investment in your operating model for these services. And a you build it, you run it model would be sufficient when looking at the financial exposure for the payment service, whereas the ops run it would be more than efficient when looking at the financial exposure for the order management system. So because there's such a big difference in financial exposure and development throughput between services, you can and you should have different operating models. But it's important to take into account both of these factors when you're choosing your operating model. A digital service will commonly benefit from you build it, you run it, because it'll have a high feature demand and a high financial exposure on failure. Whereas foundational systems generally may not require you build it, you run it. It'll have low feature demand and low financial exposure on failure. If we compare that to services which might have a blend of high feature demand or low financial exposure on failure, or the opposite, a high financial exposure and a low feature demand, well, these are likely to get quite a few benefits from a you build it, you run it approach. But if you're struggling with how to select the right operating model for your service, why not contact me or Equal Experts, where we can help you with selecting the right operating model for you. So as always, for more information on you build it, you run it, or getting the most out of your team and the best out of your digital services, then check out my channel and subscribe for more content. See you again next time.